All right, we still got a few people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and jump in. We have lots to talk about tonight. So let me welcome Sarah McCammon, author of The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, which is a New York Times bestseller week one. So congratulations, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So we're going to jump in, but just by way of introduction, you probably don't need that many introductions to folks who are on my newsletter. But for those of you who don't know, Sarah is the national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. She's done work on political, social, cultural divides in America, all the things that we talk about a lot on the White Too Long newsletter. And also frequent guest host for NPR news magazines, appeared BBC, CNN, PBS, MSNBC, and I'm sure more to come now. And during 2016, Sarah was NPR's lead political reporter assigned to the Donald Trump campaign. We talk about that a little bit. And previously reported for NPR member stations in Georgia, Iowa, and Nebraska. She's joining us tonight from Norfolk, Virginia. And so welcome.
Thank you. I have to say, I am so indebted to your work, Robbie. Your polling, your analysis, your previous work, and your help making sure that I didn't go totally astray with the data in my own book. So thank you for.
I think it was very kind. I was looking back at my email, and I think the first email I have from you was, 2017, I think, when we first connected, and talked a lot about all the things we just talked about since then. So I'm really happy to get to change seats and be on this side of the microphone for this conversation. And you and I have talked, and I do want to say, like, we do have a lot in common in terms of background. And we'll talk about this, but we obviously come from different sides of the gender divide inside the white evangelical world, which is pretty important in terms of how we experienced that world. But and you come from the Midwest, I come from the Deep South. But a lot of common things. I thought I'd highlight a couple for our listeners. So out of this evangelical world, very active, both of us in that world. So at church all the time. One little tidbit that I did not know, I think, until I read the book, is that you interned for Phyllis Schlafly.
That I did when I was just 16 years old.
Back in the day. And when I was 17, I worked for Billy Graham.
There you
go. So we have that in common.
We have the bona fides, don't we?
That's right. We can really count it. And personally, I think we both married our first partners inside that evangelical world, and after those marriages ended, both built new families with Jewish partners. So we have that kind of experience in common as well. And I think the other thing I would highlight is I think that our professions and kind of curiosity about the world carried us beyond the borders of that world, right, in ways that began to be kind of problematic, that we've had to wrestle with. And I think that came through really clearly in the book. So I thought I'd start off with this question. As an author, I've found that talking about a book and writing a book are different things. And I often realize, I don't know how to talk about this book that, I just wrote. And I wonder if you've had that experience, and maybe, like, now that you've been on the road and talking a little bit about this book, what parts of the book have you found yourself maybe talking about more than you might have expected, that have just kind of come to the fore as you're, having to do this kind of verbal treatment of the book?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I kind of feel like, and I don't want to nerd out for too long on the writing process, but like, even when I'm writing radio stories that are 4 minutes long, I often kind of feel like I kind of feel the story in my gut before I can really tell you what it is. And I kind of have to write it to find it. And it's a lot like, I don't actually know anything about sculpting, but like I imagine sculpting to be, like you're just kind of pulling things away until you get to this thing you have in your head. And with a book, it's kind of that way, although, in order to sell a book proposal, someone expects you to write out what you're going to do in advance. And so I had thought a lot about this book for years after covering the 2016 campaign, and I kind of felt it like germinating and growing and refining a little bit. But then you're right, like when the moment comes that it's actually a real thing and people want you to talk about it, it's a lot of things. Like this book is partly about Trump, but it's also not about Trump. It's partly my story, but it's also a lot of other people's stories. It's about politics, but it's also about religion. And so I think in some ways I have talked about Trump less than I expected to. A lot of people have wanted to know, and maybe this shouldn't be a surprise, but a lot of people have really wanted to know about my own background, like what was that like for me growing up? And I'm happy to talk about that because that, really one of the goals in writing this book is I really wanted to paint a picture, like a really granular textured picture of what it felt like for me and for a lot of other people to grow up in the evangelical world, because I think it helps answer a question that I get asked all the time, and I'm sure I know you do too, since 2016, which is, why do evangelicals support Trump?
Right.
And so I wanted to kind of show rather than tell in a lot of ways, and so that's kind of what I tried to do.
Great. Well, we're going to get to some other things, but I want to make sure I do a little table setting too. I want to get that on the table first to get the conversation started. Let me invite everyone who's here. If you want to check in on the chat, it should be open. So if you just want to check in with your name, where you're from, that'd be great. We also have the Q&A section open. So we're going to go, about 20, 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So if you want to go ahead and queue up some questions in the Q&A, feel free to do that. So the next place I wanted to go is, I thought you so powerfully talked about fear and anxiety, and like what role that played in that evangelical world is something you wrestled with, and many of us wrestle with, and this kind of tension between, or maybe even contradiction between, a command to love the world, bring the world to salvation on the one hand, and that it's a really dangerous place you should stay away from, on the other, and how all of that worked. So I just want to, if you could say just a little bit more about that and how it felt, because I think it's a key part of the experience, is kind of growing up with that real tension and kind of anxiety in the air.
It's something a lot of people have tapped into in the interviews I've done about the book. And part of me has wondered, well, maybe I was just an anxious kid. But I think, again, like this is part of why I wanted to write my story in conversation with a lot of others, because I don't think that it was that unusual. Partly because there was such an emphasis on, hellfire and brimstone, and this really urgent literal view of, eternal damnation as being, just sort of just on the other side of our consciousness if we're not careful. And, for a young child, I think that, young children, I mean, I have children, you have children, as they grow, you see how sort of malleable their minds and their imaginations are. And what they're, what your parents tell you, what your community tells you is really real and really vibrantly real. And so, and it was supposed to be. I mean, I think that was the intention, because most of the people in my community really believed that they had this sort of vision of the truth that they needed to share with the world. And so for me, though, that created a lot of tension. I've wondered if, especially for people like my parents who came to faith a little bit older, kind of, with the energy of the Jesus movement, the kind of post-hippie period, I think it must have just felt so different to find this faith and embrace it. Whereas for me, it was something that was inherited. And I talk in the book a lot about my grandfather as sort of this symbol of the secular lost world. He was the one person we knew well who was not, quote unquote, saved. And there was just a lot of fear about what would happen to him and to other people who didn't accept our belief system. And you talk about loving the world, and I think you get such mixed messages sometimes, because the Bible says that God so loved the world, and we're supposed to love everyone, but it also says love not the world or the things that are in the world. And so there's this sense of needing to save the world, but also be at a remove from it. And for me, as a child trying to make sense of the only world I knew, those mixed messages were really confusing and sometimes quite frightening.
Yeah, and I was struck by, I think I've got this right. You said at age 2.5
I know.
that you prayed like to be saved, right?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
saved from hell at age 2.5. Is that right?
That's what my parents told me. And I mean, I know that at like 4, I did it again because I couldn't really remember it. I think I had like,
Yeah,
so I mean, you know this, Robbie, but like,
I was 6. Yeah, I
you were
made it to
6.
6.
I
Yes.
feel like 4 is like the age for most people that I knew. And so
Yeah.
2.5 is a little young, but like we would sit down and pray the sinner's prayer. You know, there was this idea that you had to believe and ask Jesus into your heart, and that's how you got saved. And we talked about this all the time. And so I imagine that what I must have done is simply repeated after my parents this prayer. And yeah, and I wrote it down in my little purple Bible, which is right here.
Wow.
I wrote my key dates, baptism and salvation and all of that. But yeah, at age 4, and I do have a vague memory of this, and it's more just like one of those facts I've always known about myself. At age 4, I was worried that it hadn't really taken, or that I hadn't really meant it because I couldn't remember it very clearly. And I knew that I had gotten saved, but I just wanted to do it again. So we prayed again. And it's funny, I heard from somebody who read the book who was like, I did the same thing, maybe a little bit older. Um, because there was so much fear of getting it wrong.
Yeah. And did that hit you again? Because I know for me, actually, and for many other people, the other place that it hit again is it's a developmental stage when you hit the teen years, right? You're like, oh, wait, did I mean that when I was 6? How could I have meant that when I was 6? When you have your new 13-year-old or 14-year-old brain, right? And other, traditions have confirmation, bat mitzvahs, right? Coming of age things because of that developmental shift, to kind of recognize that, that thing. So I don't know, did it hit you again? Like, that.
I'd say around 13, it was more, honestly, more questioning it than
Yeah.
anything. Not so much the sense of panic of, do I really have it right? I mean, it was really the toddler years. And again, you have to understand that almost every night at dinner, we were praying for grandpa to get saved. And so for me, it was like rote. And so I had made sure I said that prayer. And then, when I was in about 1st grade, my mother, for some reason, told me about this passage in Matthew about the unforgivable sin, which, theologians have debated what that means. And I just remember, being completely in a panic when I heard that there was a sin that couldn't be forgiven. Because again, we were always being warned about the importance of salvation. And I thought I had it covered. And then suddenly, like, oh, there's like a catch, there's like a footnote or a fine print kind of thing here. There's something I could do that would still send me to hell. And I remember, I have this very clear memory. I think I just had like a very vivid imagination as a kid, but of going to school the next day and just feeling sick to my stomach. It was 2nd grade. It was 2nd grade. And being like so afraid that I would somehow commit the unforgivable sin. And so that was kind of my elementary school experience. I had like years and years of not being able to sleep because of that fear. So by junior high, I think it was more starting to question where it all came from. I remember, like, I think I talk about this in the book, but in my Christian school history class, talking about explorers and just thinking about like the size of the earth and like all the initial contact between civilizations, and just realizing that there were all of these people who had never heard about Christianity, or if they did, I would realize later it was in a really brutal and awful way, encounters with colonization and so forth, and enslavement. And although I wasn't thinking about that in junior high, I was just more thinking about the fact that people hadn't heard. And so at that age, I started to just really struggle with this idea that God had made all of these people over this big, big world. And so many of them were going to be lost and had been lost over human
Yeah.
history. Mm-hmm.
No, that anxiety resonated so much with me from my own upbringing. You and I have talked about this, but we at PRI we had a survey that just came out about why people left and who were raised religious and left. And when we isolate it to white evangelicals and we asked about reasons, it was this first time we've actually asked this question, so we don't have trend data on it, but we found that a majority, like 51% of former evangelicals, said they left because they decided it was bad for their mental health, right? So that kind of anxiety, and you said like not sleeping and like that as a kid, right? Those kinds of things that actually resonated pretty deeply with people in our national survey. I want to ask you about another word. So that's kind of fear and anxiety, that was about the turn, right, to leave. And the word that I kind of put to it was integrity. I was intrigued with many of the stories, your own story you told, and I was going to give you a few examples and get you to comment on it. Like, you described it as a cognitive dissonance that became overwhelming, right? This is kind of this thing that you were wrestling with. You also described, a letter to your mom that you wrote when you were telling her that you weren't on the same page with her about LGBTQ issues. And you wrote that you came to different convictions, and this is your, quote, not because I wanted to hurt you, but because my conscience required it. And then we'll just a couple more. You quote Stephanie, is it Stalvey or Stalvey?
Stalvey.
Stalvey, yeah. Who's a Florida-based art teacher who described it as being forced to choose between this world that we knew and our conscience, right? And so there was just that theme, I think, throughout the book. So I thought I'd just kind of get you to talk a little bit about the sense that, there's like one narrative from within the evangelical movement sometimes that kind of disparages people who leave, right, as rebels, sinners, reprobates, backsliders, like whatever. But then you hear these stories, right? And they're saying like, no, like I left because like I couldn't live a life of integrity and stay.
Yeah, and I think it takes a lot to overcome that, because you are told, the world will try to persuade you of its ways. The devil is out to get your soul. This is languaged in a variety of different ways, but the message is essentially, you have to fight against being pulled away. You will be tempted to be pulled away, but you have to fight it. And so when you have those doubts and misgivings about things, it's easy. The natural inclination can be to go, well, this is just what I was warned about. I'm just being tempted. I mean, I think there is a narrative out there, and I kind of touch on it in some of the later chapters about the response from some evangelical leaders to the whole narrative around deconstruction, which is that, well, people want to sin, or they want to be cool, they want to be accepted by the world. And I struggled with that, because I'd been told this too. I'd heard similar things growing up, but I think I've searched my own heart pretty thoroughly about this, and I've talked to lots of people, and I don't think wanting to accept and include people like my gay grandfather, who again is a big part of the book. I don't think that was about wanting to be cool or wanting to fit in. I think it was, I felt sort of friction with my extended family over my immediate family's views of him. But I think that friction was appropriate, because it was in response to something that was really, I came to feel not good. I mean, I looked at my grandfather's life, or the life of other people I knew who didn't line up with what many evangelicals would have said was the right way to be. And I couldn't see anything that was harmful or that was problematic. In fact, I saw a lot of good and wonderful things in those people. And to condemn them began to feel very wrong. And it began to feel like the opposite of good. And you can't just push away those feelings and thoughts forever. You can, I think a person can only exist with so much cognitive dissonance before it really kind of destroys you.
Yeah, it just leads me right to the next. I was, if I'm kind of moving down, had these like words that kind of kept, the other one I wanted to talk about is love. You write, ultimately for me, it came down to love for my grandfather and for the LGBTQ plus friends and colleagues I'd begun to meet as I discovered the world outside of what a friend of yours called the bubble. All right. And that reminded me, I've been shaped, I think, a lot by James Baldwin's writing. And it reminded me of something from The Fire Next Time that he said about, it wasn't about religion, but it was about God, actually. And he said this: if the concept of God has any validity or any use, it can only be to make us larger, freer, and more loving. If God cannot do this, then it is time we got rid of him. And that's Baldwin. So I thought I'd just give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about, and say just a little bit more about, you've mentioned a couple of times the story of your grandfather, but it is a kind of beautiful story that you weave really throughout the book. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, and how that fits into your own journey.
Yeah, so my grandfather, as I mentioned, was one of the few people I knew who was sort of outside of the evangelical bubble. You know, I went to Christian school, was in church every Sunday, sometimes went to Wednesday night services or youth activities. And my world was really reinforced by, you know, people that thought like we did. And I talk a lot in the book about kind of this parallel universe almost of, you know, evangelical institutions and broadcasting and books and publishing that sort of really formed a cocoon around my life. And of course I had some exposure to pop culture and the outside world. It wasn't like I was completely cordoned off from anything like that, but it was, as I said, at a remove and carefully curated and carefully sort of restricted. And so there was, you know, limited opportunity to think about people who were different, except for the fact that I had this grandfather and several extended family members who were not evangelical. You know, my parents had both kind of come to an evangelical faith as teenagers, to various degrees separately and independently from their own parents. And so this was something they were kind of forging on their own. And it meant that we were, while we were in this community of other evangelicals in our own family, we were a little bit alone, especially on my father's side. And so all of this concern about my grandpa, it commanded my attention. And I think it actually had the effect of making me think a lot about what I really believed. Like, do I really believe the things I'm being told about him? And, you know, I think another factor was that he was, you know, in addition to being the only not evangelical person or one of very few in our circle, he was also like one of the most accomplished people that I knew. He was a neurosurgeon. He had a ridiculous number of impressive hobbies. And I don't really know how he managed to be like an incredible chef and an incredible classical pianist at the same time that he was also a husband, father, neurosurgeon. But he's like someone I would like to be a fraction of when I grow up someday. And so it's hard to look at his life and think, well, there's a problem. You know, there's a person who's really going down the path to destruction. He was sort of like a paradigmatically functional and successful human being, and it was hard not to notice that. And so his existence really created a foil for everything that I was being told. And I love that James Baldwin quote. And when I read The Fire Next Time, that also stood out to me, probably for similar reasons. And it kind of reminds me of the conversation I had in college with one of my, you know, I went to an evangelical college. And ironically, maybe some of the professors that I met there and got to know there, in many ways, I think paved a way for my own kind of deconstruction, to use the parlance of the internet. Because I met, you know, these professors who had studied a lot, thought a lot, many of whom would privately tell me that they wrestled with certain aspects of our tradition, especially things like, you know, young earth creationism. And I was struggling with exclusivist theology. And I just remember having this conversation with one of my professors about that, and with just grappling with that part of the theology we were taught. And she said to me, you know, I don't have room for anything that divides me from other people. Any kind of religion that divides me from other people, that cuts me off from other people, I don't have any use for. And she didn't really answer my question directly, but she said that. And it's something that stuck with me ever since, because I think that's kind of where I was headed at that time myself, and was trying to kind of put words to it.
Mm-hmm. Hey, let's pause on that word deconstruction for a minute, because you're right. It has its own little life on Twitter and, you know, the social media sphere. But I thought I'd get you to talk about it a little bit, and like, what does it mean to you? Why is it important? And why is it, I don't know, cause so much heat in some of those conversations?
Yeah, well, this is a word like exvangelical in the title of my book, which did not exist 20 years ago when I was in my early 20s and going through this process myself. You know, right out of college, I think, is probably when I most actively deconstructed, although in a way that's been happening my whole life. But deconstruction seems to mean, at least on the internet, obviously there's a philosophical meaning of it, and I'm not going to go into like all the thinking of Jacques Derrida because I don't
I
know
don't think
much about
anybody
it.
who's talking about on the internet knows anything about that.
Nope, and that's not what we're talking about. So, but it's basically a word that's emerged to describe this very process of sort of like disentangling, unpacking, rethinking, analyzing one's religious background. And I've seen it used by ex-Mormons, ex-Catholics, ex-Christians of a variety of stripes. It doesn't necessarily apply only to ex-evangelicals, although I think that's kind of one of the biggest spaces for it, just because of the numbers of evangelicals that exist and some of the things that are going on in the world right now that I think have prompted some of these conversations. But I think it's a useful term because it doesn't really say anything about where you land. It just kind of says that you're rethinking. And for a lot of people, that involves looking at things like biblical criticism, looking at biblical, the history of how the Bible was put together, the history of the church, trying to understand kind of how the sausage was made. I know for me, the more that I'm fascinated by church history, and I've, studied it just kind of in an amateur way since college, but understanding more about the history of the Bible and some of the debates around what should be in the canon and what should not be, that emerged in the first centuries of the church, and then again during the Protestant Reformation, was kind of helpful for me in trying to see the Bible for kind of what it is. And
Lee
as
Greenwood should be there, right?
What's Lee Greenwood? Yeah.
Council of Nicaea, I think. Yes.
I hear if you need a Bible, there are some available on the internet.
Let's don't go there, but go ahead. Yeah.
But yeah, so for me, that was part of it, was just kind of understanding really, the role of human beings in sort of sorting through what became my understanding of Christianity. And that's not to say that there's anything that's sort of like neither here nor there about what to make of Christianity, but it just helped me to understand. I don't know. I think I'd been sort of told that the Bible was sort of like handed down from on high. It wasn't to that extent. I guess it wasn't literally handed down on high, but that was kind of the impression I had. And so it was comforting for me, I guess, in a way to learn more about that. And then deconstruction also can involve just sort of reconstructing one's beliefs and trying to find, maybe a new religious tradition, or maybe kind of a more generic spiritual approach to thinking about the world. So it means a lot of different things to different people, I guess.
Well, I like what you said there at the end. I think that's one of the reasons why it becomes sort of a bugaboo word, because it sounds like it's just destructive, right? It's like it not just deconstruct, but you mentioned like it's about reconstruction. The other thing I would say, like, really is kind of puzzling to me, again, as someone who was expected to take, serious thinking about the Bible and serious thinking about theology as something a responsible Christian does in the world, that like there, in some ways, that what you described as deconstruction sounds to me like religious education and discipleship. That's the kind of one of the things you're supposed to do, right? Is like actually learn more about it and the kind of challenge your assumptions and, try to come to the strongest conclusions you could come to based on the best evidence we have, like those kinds of things. But yeah, it has become, this odd, I feel like it's in the same bucket as like critical race theory in many ways, that word just gets kind of thrown around as kind of a word that sounds scary and sounds bad, right? But when you start unpacking it, you're like, wait a minute. There's much more to it here.
I think some church leaders feel understandably threatened by it, but I think you're right. I think a lot of it is just about, I love the way you said that about religious education. And, there's a long tradition, especially in kind of more liberal Protestantism, of encouraging that kind of learning. But I think in some evangelical settings, there is a hesitancy around some of those, around looking.
Well, you probably memorized the same verses I did, right? Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Like this is supposed to be a serious task, right? To continue to work it out as you go. So we're gonna make sure I leave a lot of time for questions here, but I do want to ask about the end, and then I will give up my bully pulpit seat here. But I often I pay attention to beginnings and endings of books because I know you spend a lot of time as an author thinking about like how do you land the plane and what do I really want to say here. I was drawn to two words that you begin the last paragraph with, and I want to ask you about them. The words are "I've relaxed," right?
Yeah.
And I think because I think there's actually a lot in those two words based on the rest of the book. But I'll read what you wrote and then I'll let you. So you say, "I've relaxed most of the time into the understanding that I didn't have to save Grandpa and that I don't have to save anyone. That I, like everyone else, was somehow born naked into this world, knowing nothing, a tiny bundle of flesh and blood and bones, pulsating with needs and desires, and that someday, if I'm very fortunate, I will be lying in a quiet, sunlit room in a withering body, holding the hand of my grandchild, gently fading away." One, I just want to say I love long, complex sentences. That's a great one. So thank you for that. But I've relaxed, but then you've got this little positive most of the time afterwards. So I thought I'd ask you about that part of it.
Well, there's a whole chapter on religious trauma for a reason.
Yeah.
I think it's something that a lot of evangelicals that I've talked to still struggle with, whether it's just like this deeply baked in sense that they're doing something wrong by leaving, that there can be some, and trauma is a word that has a specific definition, and I know that not every hardship is trauma, but I think in talking to some psychologists and counselors who work in this space, for a lot of people it really does meet the definition, whether it's the really complex and difficult untangling of sort of one's identity and some of the things that go along with that, including maybe family rejection or sort of censure by people that you love. Certainly the theology around things like hell, that's very hard to overcome when it's baked into you at your earliest ages. Of course, there are types of trauma that occur in church settings, like sex abuse, that would be traumatic in any setting, but there's, I think, a specific kind of spiritual layer to that for some people when it happens in an environment where you're not only being abused, but trusting someone with your spiritual life who's also an abuser. Like that's sort of compounded trauma in a certain way. And, then I even talk to people who have trauma or who were, really terrified as kids of things like the rapture, the specific parts of evangelical theology, which I don't know that I had trauma from that, but I definitely had a lot of fear around the idea of just being sucked up into the clouds or maybe
check
not.
the other bedrooms when you wake up, make sure you weren't the only one there.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's such a common experience for kids who grew up believing in that. So all of those things, I think, they do shape the way that you experience the world from an early age. And I think it's hard to totally relax when your whole sort of cognitive world was shaped by that from an early age. I think a lot of people end up going to therapy. Not everyone, but a lot of people do. And that's why I say I'm much more relaxed about it. I think when I use my rational brain and I think about the world and what I know and what I feel okay. But there are times, like I write about in the book, about waking up in the middle of the night, just afraid like I was when I was a kid, because I think it's just conditioned into me, and maybe that'll totally go away someday, but, and it mostly has, but not totally, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
Man, I feel like this sounds so pathetic. Like this is a therapy session.
No, thank you for that. And I just say I really so appreciate your like just frankness and honesty. It just rings so clearly true and honest, and so I really appreciate that about the book. So here's the book. Let me just kind of hold this up before we go to question and answer. It is on the New York Times bestseller list. You should buy it. It is a really great book. So let me go to some questions. We're gonna do this two ways. I've got a few questions in the Q&A. I'm also monitoring, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question, I think I've now mastered the technology enough to actually let you talk and ask a question. We won't be able to see you, but we'll be able to hear you. But let me start with a question from Mary Delgado, who says, is there a chance for deeply evangelical believer to change? And if possible, how?
Well, first of all, like that is not my objective in writing the book. I'm not trying to persuade anybody to change or think differently or pray differently or vote differently. I mean, I really just wanted to describe what I experienced and what I was beginning to see online as I paid attention to these evangelical spaces, what other people had experienced. And so, but I think, you know, my own experience would be an example of the fact that, yes, people do change their minds about things. And I think if, you know, I guess if I were talking to you, Mary, I would ask you more about kind of where that question comes from. If there's someone in your life that you're, you know, struggling with or not seeing eye to eye with. But I think that, I guess one thing I hope that this book will do is for people sort of outside the evangelical world, provide just some insight and compassion, because it is very hard it can be very hard, as I've said, to disentangle some of this. And even some of the ideas that, you know, like the homophobic ideas that I find really appalling today, they came from a place of ignorance, at least for me, when I had those ideas. And so I think understanding that can be helpful if you're interacting with somebody who holds those sorts of views.
Thanks. All right, I got one more from Larry. Again, if you want to raise your hand, I'll see you pop up in the participants list if you want to ask one verbally. This is from Larry in the Q&A. I'm fascinated by the way white evangelicals sequester their children through homeschooling, limit their exposure to popular culture, etc., because they don't want their children to be indoctrinated by the secular world. But it seems to me they've got things backwards. Exposure to new and unfamiliar ideas is the opposite of indoctrination, is it not? Question. So like that contradiction between not wanting to be indoctrinated and using that about external influences while kind of limiting so closely. And you talk about, you could talk about the textbooks, because you talk a lot about the homeschooling textbooks in the book that you encountered.
Yeah, in Christian school. So I went to Christian school. A lot of evangelical kids go to homeschool. Many evangelical kids go to public school, but so this, you know, I always say this experience, my experience is my experience. I think there are some things that are pretty common, maybe near universal, if you grew up evangelical at a certain time, but it is a big movement. There are lots of, you know, differences and there's a spectrum of experience. But yeah, you know, one of the things I wanted to do as I was writing the memoir parts of this book is kind of check my memory on, because all these things happened a long time ago. And I didn't want to ask people to just take my word for it. So I went back and I kind of went online and looked at old textbooks that were for resale and basically ordered the covers that I recognized. So pretty much every book that's cited in the book is, to the best of my ability, some close to something that I had in school. Abeka is produced a publishing company from Pensacola Christian University. I think it is now University in Florida. And then Bob Jones University Press in South Carolina. Those are the two that I cite for the most part, because those are the two textbook companies that informed most of my Christian school education and many other evangelical kids in Christian schools and homeschool. And they paint a pretty rosy view of American history. They, you know, to reference something you've written a lot about, Robbie, they paint a pretty glowing image of white Christian America, or predominantly white Christian America.
Christopher Columbus.
Yes. They speak highly of Christopher Columbus. There's even one passage from one of the textbooks that speaks about, you know, slavery in pretty glowing terms, talks about the nice, warm southern air, keeping slaves healthy. And, you know, they were honestly worse than I remembered when I went back and looked at them. And, you know, I don't think that most I don't think that most of the parents in my Christian school environment thought that slavery was a good thing, but the fact that those types of books could be just the curriculum and would just kind of go over people's heads, I think it says a lot about maybe a lack of sensitivity at minimum, a lack of prioritization of racial justice, which is something that I talk about in one of the chapters in the book. And so those books, they paint a very limited and often very inaccurate view of the world. And I haven't even talked about the science textbooks, which are, devoted to perpetuating young earth creationism. But I think to believe things like that, to believe that that most of scientific theory, most of scientific study, mainstream science is wrong and misguided. You really have to shelter children and carefully curate what they're exposed to, because otherwise, to put it bluntly, reality will seep in. And again, not all evangelicals are young earth creationists, but it's everybody that I grew up around pretty much was.
Yeah, a related question from John here says, I'm curious about the opposite of the book's focus, but I think it goes to this bubble. What do we understand about people who lived in the bubble and never question it? And he's teeing that up for both of us. After you.
I guess I don't know, because I don't know the insides of other people's heads, and so I don't know if people really don't ever question it or not. I imagine that for some people, there's a lot of fear of asking too many questions, and everybody's temperament and wiring and environment is different. And so, I had like someone right in front of me that kind of forced me to question, but maybe if I hadn't, I would have just merrily sailed along. And, sometimes it would be a lot easier. It's a lot easier to just sort of stay in your community and not, not engage in a way that's going to cause friction, because that part of it isn't fun. But I don't know what you think, Robbie.
Well, I don't know. And what else? Well, before I go to me, what else would you say? Like, I'm going back to that line you said, because I think it was so insightful and right, of this kind of building cognitive dissonance, right? That just would not go away and actually kept getting stronger. What were maybe so you've talked about your grandfather's kind of this anchor point of that, right, in your life that was constant. And you've talked about getting to know gay and lesbian friends, right? That was another component. Were there other kind of waypoints that you would say, oh yeah, that's another kind of wave of dissonance that kind of entered my life and wouldn't go away?
Well, I mean, I touched earlier on learning more about the history of the church. I remember in my Christian school we had a section on in my Bible class on how the Bible was put together. And that was like really kind of mind blowing for me when we started talking. I mean, to my teacher's credit, we started talking about the different genres of scripture, the fact that there's poetry and there's history and all this other stuff. And of course, we were being told that it was all literally true and directly inspired by God, and that everything in it was exactly as it should be. But then we started talking about, manuscripts. And I just remember, like, for the first time thinking, well, how do we know that the right books are in the Bible? And I asked my teacher that, and he just didn't have an answer. It was just, well, God guided the process, and so it must be so. And I would ask a lot of questions like that, or when I asked my teachers about, what about people who'd never heard of Jesus? What would happen to them? And I just often I felt like the answers that felt really pressing and important, I wasn't getting satisfying answers to. And I mentioned science a minute ago. It became pretty clear to me that most people that I knew didn't believe in young earth creationism. And I was kind of being told that these Christians out there who believed in evolution were really suspect. Like maybe they weren't even saved, because to believe that you had to believe a lot of other things about the Bible that were problematic. And so I didn't really see some kind of resolution, merging of faith and science as a possibility. It was kind of presented as an either or. And that felt like an increasingly unsustainable opinion, especially as I got into college and learned more. So there were just so many little things that felt like they either didn't add up, didn't seem factual, or didn't align with my moral instincts.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll say for me, like it was some intellectual things. Like I remember distinctly my first week at seminary. One of the first things they had us do is go buy our books. And we go buy, and I was taking Greek at my Southern Baptist, and I had to go buy a Greek New Testament. And as soon as and so when you registered at Southwestern Seminary, you had to sign that you believed in the Baptist faith and message, right? Which is about the inerrant Word of God, and that was kind of part of your worldview. And then I go to my first Greek class and I'm getting a Greek New Testament. And if you flip through the text, it's got like Greek text up here, and then there's a line somewhere in the middle of the page, sometimes higher or lower, and below that line are all the variants of the
Yeah.
text. And I
Yeah.
was like, wait a minute. I just had to like affirm my belief in like the inerrant Word of God, and now you're handing me a text that's got like the text and then like all the variants to the text on the bottom. Something doesn't quite add up here. So I mean, it's just like that was like a little example, but then I think the other things for me were relationships, like you've said. I think it was being in relationships. I distinctly remember like being in relationships and finally having like real friendships with people who were gay or lesbian, many of whom were actually living better Christian lives than I was living, right?
Mhm.
And realizing, oh, okay, like I can't continue this like abstract judgment about that I've been taught while experiencing this in real time. Like so that distance. But like the biggest thing for me, I think that, and you talked about this so well in the book, is that there's so much about that world that's like black and white,
Mhm.
right? It's right, it's wrong, it's black, it's white. There's no grays, and that just doesn't. As you get older, it ceases to fit the world, right?
Yeah.
And our
Yeah.
experience. I think it becomes so hard to hold on to that kind of black and white. Those people are in, those people are out. When you really, you start thinking about the vastness of the world, and you start thinking about Christopher Columbus named the Christ bearer, right? Who enslaved
Right.
and mutilated, people in the name of Christianity. It is, it's pretty tough, I think. And so I think is that's been part of the journey, I think for me. And I do think it's harder and harder for people not to ask those questions today, which is why we're seeing the crisis that we're seeing in the evangelical church today.
Well, this has been, if I can just add one thing, this
Yeah,
has been, for me, a fascinating part of learning more through my spouse about Judaism, which obviously is where Christianity came from. And of course, there are different types of Judaism, and I'm not an expert on it, but just the existence of like the Midrash and this tradition in Judaism of debating, analyzing, interpreting the scripture, and really kind of thinking about it, and rabbis arguing about what it means. It feels so like such a different approach to scripture
yeah,
than what evangelicals take, which is sort of like, yes, we can argue about it, but there's there's fundamentally kind of like a real policing of where you're supposed to land within evangelicalism. And and I think a sort of messier, looser approach to life, to scripture and to life, it feels much more workable for me at least.
yeah. I remember the first time I realized in that sort of Jewish, Midrash tradition that like the minority opinions are preserved, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
the ones that won the day or won the argument, but like all the minority traditions are, and you can go back to them, right? And you can kind of like, oh, well, actually, we can take this and do that. Like, whereas I think in so much of Christianity, at least the Christianity as I got put it there, no, there were Orthodox and there were heretics, right? That's
Right.
that's who there were, and you can't go back and retrieve the heretics, right, without getting into some serious trouble. So I've got a question here. It's a personal one. So how have your parents and family reacted to the book? How's that going?
Most of my family's been really supportive. I did, as I was writing the book, I thought hard about what I wanted to talk about, what I wanted to share, and I wanted to make sure that I really clearly communicated the reasons that I had moved away from the evangelical tradition. And some of those reasons are quite painful, and some of them are personal. And I knew that there was no way that I could write about my childhood and my childhood faith without writing about my family. So I tried to, as much as possible, respect people's wishes. I, had to talk about my parents. It was not possible to avoid that. So I did share, significant sections of the manuscript with them, and I took their feedback into account. I can't say that they're thrilled with it, but they weren't blindsided, at least. And I made some changes in response to their feedback. Um, since then we've been on pretty good terms. There are just things we don't talk about a whole lot, and I think that's a pretty common experience for people who've made a transition like I have. If you want to preserve a relationship and everybody has strong feelings about things that are very, very different, sort of opposed strong feelings, sometimes the safest thing to do is to sort of cordon off certain areas that are just, just to have boundaries, I guess, around what you do and don't talk about. But I love my family very much. I love all of them, and I've tried to be fair and honest about what I've said.
All right, let me see if I have another one. I have one more question I want to ask you too. Yeah, let me ask you this. So, we talked about like the loss, I think it's like the fear, the anxiety. But I think, obviously, you've embarked on this journey to get somewhere, right? Not just to leave something. So what have you found? Not just what have you lost, but like, what have you found?
I feel much more connected to all sorts of people, than I felt like I could be when I was inside the evangelical world. I feel more free to ask questions and follow them wherever they lead. I understand the appeal of a sort of strong theological tradition, and I would love to feel like I had more answers to a lot of things, but I don't think that rushing those answers or pretending like you know things you don't is very valuable, at least not for me. So, have I arrived at some kind of like certain conclusion about all of the things that my childhood faith said it answered? No, I have not. But I think when I look around, when I look at the way the world is, and I think about, the wonderful diversity in this country of belief, of experience, of background, of culture, I just, to the degree that I'm speaking as a person here, not a journalist, but to the degree that I am spiritual and believe in God, I want to believe that everybody, all of that is an expression of something, divine or beautiful. And if you don't believe in God and don't want to talk about it that way, that's fine with me too. But that's kind of how I think about it. Like, I think that gay people like my grandpa are made in the image of God just as much as I am. And I think that allowing, opening my view of what's good and what's okay has, I don't know, it's enriched my life. It's made me, I feel happier. I feel more authentic, and more just able to sort of move through the world without that tension and that cognitive dissonance that I talk about so much. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think I feel, much the same way, that sense of, yeah, able to move. I used that word earlier when I was asking a question, but like being able to move through the world with integrity in a way that it was hard to do, I think. And that was always this kind of odd feeling of, you want to think about religion as kind of opening you up to the world, right? And and I think it's so much of, King. One of my other things kind of stayed with me again with that Baldwin quote, but Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he talked about white evangelical churches, especially, and all the white Christians. He described as sitting safely behind the anesthetizing power of stained glass windows, right? That it kind of shut down our consciences. There's certain things you couldn't think about, especially like racial justice, those kinds of things. You just could not think about those things. I've got one raised hand here. Let me see if I can work the technology. All right, so this is Mary. I'm kind of turn it on as a question. We'll have time for maybe one more. We'll see. All right, Mary, can you talk?
I think so. Can you hear me?
There you are. Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, good. Yeah, the question that I did, the second question I had was, is evangelicalism today the way, okay, I'm not evangelical, so I'm an outsider and I look at this. Is it more political and cultural rather than theological?
Great.
I think there are smart people who would argue that yes, that has become increasingly a political label. There was always a political, all of my life at least, and Robbie's life, there's been a political project attached to white evangelicalism that I think was increasingly mobilized basically around the time we're a few years apart in age, but around the time you and I both came on the scene, Robbie, was really when the moral majority was mobilizing and doing its thing. And so I think that's, but I think that's increasingly true today. I don't know how you would answer that.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I've got like there's a normative answer to that question. There's like a descriptive answer to that question. And I think more and more I'm actually leaning toward the descriptive answer. The normative question would be to say, well, there's a kind of normative view of like what a healthy Christianity looks like, right? And those things are properly Christian. And want to say things outside of that, like people who are rabidly like enslavers, right? My Southern Baptist forebears who thought enslaving other people was compatible with the gospel. We want to say, yeah, actually, that's kind of outside of normative, what we want to call like appropriate normative Christian thought. They had lost their way on that. But I think kind of, when I put on my sociology hat, there's something I worry about saying, oh, well, the evangelical movement today is just political. Because it's plenty religious, and I want to kind of hang on to that piece, right? You want to, like, I hear people saying, well, it's not, Christian nationalism is not really Christian, for example. But I kind of want to pump the brakes a bit and say, well, actually, if what you mean to say by that is that it's a dangerous form of Christianity, or it's an inauthentic maybe form even, but it's like a form that we should like work to kind of oppose, like that all I think is something I could get behind. But the idea that it's not Christian, to kind of define it out of Christianity, I think is maybe just a sleight of hand that kind of makes us not want to deal with it. So I actually want to say, no, actually Christian nationalism, for example, is Christian. And those enslavers, they were Christian. My ancestors, I've got a Bible back there from my sixth great grandfather, who saw no conflict between, it's my family Bible, saw no conflict between enslaving other people and the Christianity that he lived. And I don't want to say he's not a Christian. I want to say he was misguided and wrong about that. But I think it's important, if we're really going to think about the health of churches, the health of denominations, the health of Christianity, we got to hang on to the unhealthy parts of it as too, and not just kind of define them out of the problem. So that's the only thing I worry about, I think, with some of the rhetoric that's used about that it's, if evangelicalism is just political, right? That I think it misdiagnoses the problem.
Yeah, I think
right,
that's
we're
a really
almost at time.
point.
Sarah, go ahead. You want to add something to that?
No, I think that's a really important point. I think there's a tendency, and maybe these are both the same thing that I'm about to describe. There's a tendency to say essentially like Jesus agrees with me, Jesus would be this, would whatever I am. And there's a tendency to say that Christianity is not the things I don't like. And I think those are really dangerous impulses for a whole bunch, for the reasons you just described.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to own, for people within any tradition, to own the problems in that tradition that stem from it or feed off of it, because that's the only way that you put a stop to them, is sort of, I think, speaking within the family about the problems that exist within the family, so to speak.
All right, we are right at time. I'm going to ask you one last thing. That's just, when you were thinking about writing the book and you sent it off to the, the publisher, what and now, like, what work do you hope the book does in the world? I'll end with that question.
Well, I hope it makes people who've walked similar paths feel less alone. And this is something I've said from the beginning, and I'm hearing from a lot of people who read the book and say, thank you for, describing what it's like. And that means so much to me. And And I also hope for people, outside the evangelical world, maybe with a partner in it, who are trying to understand what they've been through, or maybe who are just trying to understand a little bit more about this culture that's been so instrumental in shaping American politics. I hope that it will provide that empathy and or insight that comes with sort of seeing our stories told in a really sort of specific and granular kind of way.
Right. Well, there was certainly so much that resonated with me coming out of this world. And so let me just thank you for this like honest and courageous and beautifully written book. So just thank you for putting it out into the world. And congratulations again on being a New York Times bestseller.
Thank you, Robbie. Thanks for the great conversation, and thanks for all of your work.
All right. Thanks so much. Good night.
Take care.